Hello, I'm Margaret Scott. I'm with the New York Southeast Asia Network, and thank you all for joining. In fact, please go to our website and sign up for our newsletter. Because of the pandemic, almost all the programming is virtual. All the programming is virtual, and people can join from anywhere. The only silver lining. There'll be another contemporary politics Indonesia event, for instance, on October 22nd with Greg Feely. We also would like, before we get started, to thank our wonderful coordinator, Srinath Poole, for organizing us, and to thank the New York University Wagner School of Public Service, which is a sponsor of tonight. Tonight and morning in Singapore and earlier in Vancouver, and wherever everybody is that's watching. We are marking the 55th year since the mass disturbances and killings, one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century, occurred in Indonesia. What happened in Indonesia was momentous, not just for Indonesia, but for all of Asia, especially China, and for altering the course of the Cold War. This event, our webinar, centered around two vitally important new books we hope will bring into focus the author's important new research and place the Indonesia genocide in a broader global context. It is an honor to host our two authors, and this event is designed to shed light on a much misunderstood, distorted, and boldly lied about period of Cold War history. Our first speaker is Taomo Zhou, Assistant Professor of History at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She specializes in modern history and Southeast Asian history. Her writing has appeared in the China Quarterly, Critical Asian Studies, and the journal Indonesia. This is Taomo's first book, which she will talk about tonight, Migration in a Time of Revolution, published by Cornell in 2019. John Russo, most of you, any Indonesianist will know, Associate Professor in History at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And he's spent the last 20 years researching and writing about the events in 1965, 1966 in Indonesia. He's written a trilogy, and we will be talking a lot about the third of the trilogy. The first was in Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, and it was The Year That Never Ended. It came out in 2004. And then his groundbreaking, utterly changing the way everybody thought about what happened, Pretext for a Mass Murder. And now, I don't have a copy, I read it online, is Buried Histories, which was published, yay, John's holding it up, Buried Histories, published in 2020 about the massacres and disappearances. So what we're gonna do is first Taomo is gonna speak, and then John's gonna speak, and then we hope, because there's so many layers here, that we'll be able to have conversation and questions. We're going to be using the Q&A, which you'll find on the bottom band of your screen. Please put in any questions that you have, and I turn it over to Taomo. Before we start, we're going to be abruptly ended when it ends, so thank you both for doing this. It's really an honor that you've come, and thank you, Nieth. Okay, over to you, Taomo.
Okay. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank Margaret for organizing this and thank Nice for her spectacular organization work. And it's my great honor to be in discussion with John, whose scholarship greatly inspired me. So I'd like to begin my talk today by zooming into a day during my fieldwork in May 2013 in Surabaya, East Java. There I met Mr. Wong De-yong, the gentleman standing in the middle. He's a third-generation Chinese descendant, and he had adopted the Indonesian sounding name Ongko, as required by the New Order legislation aiming to assimilate the Chinese minority. In 1965, his father was working as bookkeeper for Bob Berkey. He was shot dead by the Indonesian military during a search of his home. But Ongko witnessed the killing. He was only 15-year-old at the time. Standing next to me is Mbak Kanis. She's an activist and researcher on violence against Chinese women in May 1998 riots. Mba Kanis is Peranakan Chinese, but she doesn't speak Mandarin due to the ban on Chinese language education by Suharto regime. She did not experience the mass violence of 1965 herself, but she felt its long-term impact, such as being called China Meme or China Communist as a child in elementary school. But uncle and Mba Kanis experiences kind of echo with the story of Mr. Li Peinan, the gentleman standing in the middle. He's a second generation ethnic Chinese from Aceh. Mr. Li's elder brother, a member of Pemuda Rakyat, was captured and murdered by the Indonesian military authority. According to Mr. Li, local radical right-wing student groups forced more than 1,000 local Chinese, including his father, to stand in the Syrian tropical sun with black paint poured over their heads and Aceh, an acronym for Republik Rakyat China, painted on their backs. Mr. Li ultimately left Aceh in 1966 and resettled in an overseas Chinese farm in South China. Besides the returned overseas Chinese like Mr. Li, who have personally experienced the mass killings, in China today, ordinary people barely know about this history. Among those who have heard about it, they would most likely confuse it with the May 1998 riots and wrongly categorize both as anti-Chinese massacres, as you can see from the title of this article from the mainstream media Global Times. There has been ongoing controversies regarding the nature of violence in 1965. An earlier generation of scholars refute the Cold War journalism that portrayed the 65 to 66 mass violence as a genocide of the ethnic Chinese. More recently, as Giles Melvin's research showed, while the mass killing targeted the members or sympathizers of the Indonesian Communist Party, many ethnic Chinese were harassed in prison, deprived of their property, and expelled from Indonesia by implications. Under Suharto's ensuing three-decade rule, a number of discriminatory laws were passed. For example, the ethnic Chinese were given a special designation on their ID cards. The mass violence in Indonesia in 1966 and 65 is substantially different from the May 1998 riots in the sense that the later targeted ethnic Chinese. However, we can see 1998 as a historical culmination of 1965. The September 30th movement provided a new order government a pretext to propagate a narrative that portrayed any link, substantial or presumed, to China as subversive or quote-unquote dirty. The Indonesian army had made aggressive charges against the Chinese Communist Party for exporting revolution abroad. This idea was further instilled in the minds of the general population through the film Pengkhianatan G30S PKI. In the film, Chinese doctors were shown practicing acupuncture with electric shocks on the ailing President Sukarno, and their diagnosis of Sukarno's health condition as critically dangerous is presented as the trigger for the PKI's so-called coup d'etat attempt. So in my book, I was trying to answer two questions. Did Beijing instigate the Indonesian Communist Party to usurp state power by force? Was the hostility against ethnic Chinese a fitting retribution for Beijing's attempt to engineer a coup attempt in Indonesia? To cut a long story short, my book says no to both questions. First, documents from the Chinese Foreign Minister archives show that in the early 1960s, Beijing's first priority was to befriend Indonesia as part of the International United Front that was independent from both the socialist bloc led by the Soviet Union and the capitalist West led by the United States. The PRC had neither the intention nor the capability to overthrow the left-leaning government led by President Sukarno. And secondly, Despite the convergence of strategic interests between Beijing and Jakarta in the early 1960s, governmental relations inevitably intersected with communal politics. Hoping to dispel Indonesia's concern over its connection with the Chinese in Indonesia, Beijing ceased to automatically recognize all persons with Chinese blood as citizens of the People's Republic of China. But these efforts failed to fully contain the political activism among the Chinese diaspora, which had a life of its own and ultimately derailed Beijing's foreign policy goals. Thirdly, the Chinese community in Indonesia was divided along the battle lines of the Chinese Civil War, which was fought between the communist and nationalist parties. This bifurcation had a profound impact on the state-to-state relations between Jakarta and on the inter-ethnic relations in Indonesia. Many ethnic Chinese actively partook in civic campaigns launched by the pro-communist and pro-nationalist factions in Indonesia. Both sides claim that all ethnic Chinese own their loyalty to China's sole legitimate center, Beijing according to the communists or Taipei according to the nationalists. So here you can see the image of the first PRC ambassador to Indonesia, Bahrain, with the Indonesian Prime Minister Muhammad Nasir at the PRC National Day reception in Indonesia in 1950. Bahrain played a very important role in mobilizing ethnic Chinese youth and had quite interesting and also highly controversial views on the issue of class and race, and we can talk about that later. And the lower right corner, you see the picture of Chiang Kai-shek and Madam Song Mei-ling with the overseas Chinese basketball team from Indonesia, and everybody, of course, was wearing batik. So initially incited by the nationalist and communist parties, the rivalry between the pro-Taipei and pro-Beijing Chinese Indonesia later took forms specific to the diasporic community and gained unforeseen momentum that either side could control. After 1949, many ethnic Chinese experienced the establishment of the People's Republic of China as a moment of national pride and elevation of their social status. So as you can see here, on October the 1st of each year in the early 1950s, the pro-Beijing Chinese organized commemorations of the establishment of the PRC in major Indonesian cities. The political activism of the pro-Beijing faction frustrated PRC's hope to see as many ethnic Chinese as possible to settle permanently in Indonesia, aroused suspicion from the Indonesian authorities, aggravated ethnic tension, and destabilized Sino-Indonesian relations. So this is the last slide of my presentation, and I would like to end my talk with the image, which is on the cover of the Bahasa Indonesian version of my book entitled Revolusi, Diplomacy, Diaspora. The picture captures ethnic Chinese students from Surabaya before their quote-unquote return to an ancestral homeland they have never set foot on. So the book is my effort to reconstruct their experiences and inner worlds. I hope stories about these ordinary migrants during the Cold War can help us gain a better understanding of the so-called Cold War 2.0 in the age of pandemics, as well as contemporary concerns in Indonesia over the increasing presence of Chinese investment and labor. So I stop here.
Thank you. I hope we can get to that last bit in the Q&A. Thank you very much. And it's terrific to go from the Chinese part of the Cold War, both on ethnic Chinese within Indonesia and what China was doing, to John. So over to you for the more particular. And unmute yourself.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Srinath Pool. Thank you, Professor Zhou, for joining this, for organizing it. And this is really greatly appreciated Professor Zhou's presentation just now, and makes a good introduction to my own and her book as well is just has so much new in it. It's a real eye-opener. So I'll begin by commenting about the style of my book, Buried Histories. Style is its own argument, and so I want to deal with that for a little while. I was writing about massacres, and so I wanted readers to sense the tragedy of these events, to feel something about it. So I was thinking about the affective side of writing. So affective with an A. Yeah. So there's a lot of writing about the massacres, and especially in Indonesia, I tend to feel it's either very sensationalistic or it is sort of very distant, kind of remote and overly objective, aspiring to be objective, either sort of indulging in melodrama or just getting rid of emotion altogether. So I was trying to think of how to write it within a certain kind of tone, to evoke a certain kind of emotion. And so there I was thinking about how to be, somber or respectful of the dead. So it's like a funeral service where you tell stories about the people before they met their deaths, remember them about their lives, and be sort of somber about it. So I mention this too because my previous book, Pretext for Mass Murder, was written in a completely different style. So that was designed as a kind of detective story. And the big drawback of detective stories is there isn't much emotional investment in the murder victim, right? It's usually the detective is sort of walking all around the crime scene and saying, this is middle-aged white guy, husband, probably, there's no connecting with the murder victim. And so that kind of tone I thought was completely inappropriate for this book. So Pretext was about the September 30th movement. It was just about the pretext, the trigger for the violence. And this book is about the mass murder part. And for that, I wanted a very different style of writing. So the book is largely based upon oral interviews. And so I was trying to bring out a lot of personal stories. And the difficulty there was where to cut these stories, because we interviewed hundreds of people. I had to choose only a certain number of them. And when dealing with any one of these individuals, I couldn't tell their, I couldn't even aspire to tell a kind of complete version of their life history, to touch upon all of the really, sort of fascinating aspects of their lives. And so that process of editing those stories was very difficult. And this could have been a much bigger book. Every chapter, I think, could have been a book by itself. And it sort of, as I was writing it, it felt like everything could balloon outwards. And so I had to truncate things quite a bit. And there's always a kind of balance there between bringing out people's life stories enough so that the reader can sort of have some kind of emotional investment in them, but at the same time, being able to bring out a lot of these stories so that people can see a kind of pattern and people can see that this isn't some kind of idiosyncratic case by itself. But there are a number of people who I discussed in the book that I really would have liked to have written whole biographies about. And actually one of them I have, it's in manuscript form, and maybe it will come out at some point once I get my act together on putting it together. But it's the plan is to bring it out in Indonesian a book about one of the men in Bali. But at the same time, in bringing out the personal stories, in setting a certain kind of tone, I did want to, at the same time, give the reader a kind of some analytical tools to grasp the pattern behind these massacres. And so the key argument there is that we should talk about these killings as disappearances. There were many different kinds of methods used to kill people at that time. But the one that appears to have claimed the most victims was this method of disappearing prisoners. So people were taken out of detention camps or prisons, put onto trucks, and then taken somewhere somewhat remote, and then unceremoniously, anonymously buried in mass graves or dumped in rivers, or even just left by the roadside or riverside. So it's a particular kind of atrocity. It's not just killing. And so I think, when our usual terminology is, kind of terminology I have used in the past, and it's accurate enough: mass killing, mass murder, mass violence. But I did want to focus people's attention on this particular kind of murder, that, and it's a particularly insidious kind of murder, because it's not just a killing of one person. It has a destructive effect on a whole family and neighborhood, because the loved ones never know what happened. And so the stories that we encountered when we first went out to do this oral history research were all about the families who were left sort of unknowing about whether their husband or father or brother or sister or cousin or aunt or uncle died, or whether they were still alive and hiding somewhere, or whether they immigrated to someplace else like China, whether they wound up in exile and they were still safe. It was never, I mean, that's worse. That's the worst kind of killing is when there isn't any record of it having happened. And there's a kind of suffering for many, many years for the family. And just when I was speaking with a friend a few days ago about this, she told me about she grew up in East Java, and told me about one of her friends whose father was disappeared in 1965. And she said in 1985, 20 years after the fact, the family couldn't really decide whether they wanted to move out of their house or not, because they felt that if they moved out of their house, the father wouldn't have any place to come back to. They worried that the father, if the father was still alive, that he wouldn't know how to find them. I mean, that is just, I mean, but those kinds of stories are like routine in the areas where the killing took place. And this is a kind of pattern that you find from Aceh, North Sumatra, South Sumatra, Central Java, East Java, Bali, Lombok, and Flores. It's really from one end of the country to another. These are disappearances. And one reason why they're so, why I'm saying that they claim such a large number of people is because it's much easier to kill captives than to kill people who are out in the open. A lot of our images are of sort of mobs of people running amok, or, NU gangs attacking a village and raiding it and killing people in the street or something. But in those kinds of killings, it's kind of difficult to actually kill a lot of people when you do that, because the targets can flee, they resist, and there's many cases of resistance to these kinds of raids on villages. But once everybody's rounded up and they're defenseless and they're in a prison, it's a matter of kind of an assembly line operation to put them onto trucks and, and disappear them. So there's a lot more to be said there. I'll just say that the general question I was trying to deal with was how the killings could happen. And so in the book, I'm dealing with sort of why it is that the PKI was unable to resist, why the people who were the targets of this were unable to resist. And part of the pattern that I just outlined goes a long way to explaining that. And also to deal with why bystanders didn't intervene to do more, and also how the perpetrators themselves could do this, pretty much recognizing that it was an atrocity, and how they could have a kind of delusional reality, the term that I use from a genocide scholar, Jacques Semelin, to be able to have the frame of mind to commit atrocities. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
There are a lot of questions and comments, and I'm going to try to curate first on the lead up to 65, and then after the September 30th movement questions. John, one person asks the hold of the false historical narrative, and I was thinking that perhaps you might talk a little bit about how you found that the torture operated in a way that's not necessarily usually understood of what the purpose of torture is. In the Indonesia case, it was to confirm a narrative that the state wanted to put forward that has held sway since. If you could tell us a little bit about that. But the kill us, we had to kill them or they'd kill us stuff, which is the narrative that you're also saying is not right. It has no historical credence. Somebody is very concerned about what the PKI was doing before 65, and that the idea that they were innocent is overstating. Can you give us a little bit of context of that issue and also the torture and the hold of the historical narrative? Can you wrap those up?
Yeah, I think so. So on the hold of the historical narrative, I think one of the explanations for it was just how thorough the killing was and how often mysterious it was as well, so that it left victims really unable to put forward a counter narrative. They were scared, terrorized, and also very confused about what had happened. And there wasn't a kind of open public discussion for people in any one region to know exactly what had gone on in another region. So many of the victims in later years were uncertain as to what had happened in Aceh or North Sumatra or South Sumatra or anything. It was all sort of these rumors through the grapevine, and there wasn't a kind of, it was difficult to put together a general narrative that could counter the state's narrative. And so in the process, a lot of these, sort of false excuses of the perpetrators were dominant. And many foreigners who came and talked with the perpetrators just thought, well, it must be right, or there must be some legitimacy to it, to this sort of kill or be killed narrative. But in recognizing that most of these killings were disappearances, were the killing of prisoners, it's impossible to sustain the narrative that this was kill or be killed. It was entirely possible for the PKI to be repressed as a party through mass arrests. And in some places, that's how it was done. The key question is, why was that not followed in all parts of Indonesia? Why, in some cases, did mass arrests then lead to the killing of those who had been arrested? And so we need to focus our attention, focus our analytical powers really on that issue, on when the killing of prisoners began in the different areas and how that took place. And sort of, our attention, I think, has been distracted, or, we've been distracted by the image of sort of NU gangs roaming through the streets. So, and on the last part about this whole PKI jahat, PKI kejam, that narrative and so forth, as justifying the killings, is, it's atrocious itself, that kind of narrative. Because what it does is it ignores all of what the PKI was doing before 1965. PKI had mayors of cities. They had bupatis. They were ministers in the government. They were a kind of ordinary accepted political party. And even if, to be anti-communist, of course, is kind of entirely understandable. They were a threat to other people. I can understand that. But if we continue that logic, what it means is that for anybody that we don't like today, for any organization that we don't like today, we can say, this kind of behavior would justify an atrocity. It'd be okay if they get disappeared. That's not a legitimate way of talking about history, of dealing with each other. So.
Taomo, I'm going to try to put together there's a lot of questions interested in the importance of China's involvement in the September 30th movement. And you may even want to say that the documents that were released for a short period of time that led to what you wrote about, that led you to what you, as somebody asks, did the Suharto government regime exaggerate China's influence in Indonesia and claim that China had a major role in the September 30th movement? Or did the Suharto regime have intelligence information that would support that Beijing was directly involved? Because IDIT was close to Mao, and because it wound up rupturing relations, which was a really big deal. So tell us a bit about that. And then I hate to do this to you, but I also want you to start telling us about the paradox of the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. There were a lot of leftist ethnic Chinese, and there were also a lot of very, very wealthy Chinese. So there was this paradoxical view of Chinese that continues to today. But tell us what role that played in '65 so that we can lay the groundwork to talk about contemporary times too.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thanks for the questions from the audience. So first, China and Gaitigapulas. So I start with I'll focus on two documents. The first one is the discussion, the minute of the meeting between Mao and IDIT on August the 5th, 1965. So why was IDIT in Beijing? It was because he was originally on a trip from Soviet Union to Vietnam, but he was urgently called back because Sukarno was not doing well. During this discussion, basically I did show Mao a plan that highly resembled what happened in the early morning of October the 1st, 1965. So he was saying that, now it's a critical time. Either we will start first or the Indonesian military will start action first. And so what we're going to do is that we're not going to show our red flag, quote unquote, right away. We're going to organize a committee consisted of people from left, middle, and right. So in that way, we can protect ourselves. And Mao's reaction was kind of ambiguous. He kind of recalled the history of China's own, like the CCP's own strategy during the Chinese Civil War. And of course, so this document was temporarily released in the early 1990s in a collection called Mao Zedong's Meeting with Foreign Communist Party Members. It's possible that this document has been edited. It's possible that we don't see the entirety of the dialogue. But based on what we have, I think it's safe to conclude that the Chinese Communist Party was aware of what was going to happen, but they did not know when exactly it was going to happen. And it was in a shock on October the 1st, because that was China's National Day celebration, and the Chinese Foreign Service suffered a huge intelligence failure on that day. There have been more than 48 hours, during which time Beijing know nothing about what happened. They can only rely on foreign reports such as the Australian Broadcasting Company. So that suggests, I think, most likely the Suharto government exaggerated China's knowledge about the event and China's influence over the PKE. And the second document I want to comment on is that, so around like a week after October 1st, the Chinese Foreign Ministry received a very intriguing telegram from Nasution. So Nasution, in his capacity as the Minister of Defense of Indonesia, sent a telegram to congratulate the establishment of the PRC 16th anniversary. So it's not customary, according to diplomatic protocol, for a foreign Minister of Defense to send a congratulatory telegram. And the Chinese Foreign Ministry didn't know how to respond. It sounds most likely at that stage, the Indonesian military were not sure what to do with China, right? They were being very pragmatic and they were being very careful. This is in the larger context of Chinese supply of arms during confrontation. As a result, there was increased level of exchange between the Indonesian military and the Chinese military. And China, for a brief moment, was also dangling the Indonesian military with the possibility of offering nuclear technology and resources. So I think the idea that China, Mao was the architect of Politik Populace was something that was constructed afterwards, after the dust has been settled. And on the question of the Chinese Indonesia, I saw lots of concerns and questions. And one thing I want to emphasize is that, of course, it's not a monolithic group, right? There, as Margaret mentioned, there are people who are on all areas of ideological spectrum, right? They are, as audience mentioned, like strongly anti-communist Chinese, such as Yusuf Wanandi, right? And of course, externally, there was also the Republic China, Taiwan, right? Interestingly, what I found from the Academia Historica in Taipei is that agents from Taiwan, they returned to Indonesia in 1966. They befriended Enwu, they befriended the Pakistan Catholic, and they donated money, food, and drinks to Kape and Kami when they were about to launch attack on the PRC embassy in Jakarta. So in other words, they really seized this golden opportunity provided by the fall of Sukarno and the PKI so that they can turn Indonesia into the orbit of the United States and to undermine Beijing's diplomatic presence in Indonesia. And regarding the history of the Chinese Indonesia, of course, it's a very fluid, diverse group, right? I want to emphasize it's really the group's diversity, fluidity, and hybridity, right? And there has been, in the narrative about the Chinese Indonesia, a conflation of ethnicity and class, this popular understanding that all Chinese are business elites. And admittedly, of course, like as historians such as Liu Srinata argue that it's more likely for the average Chinese to live in a brick house, to own a car, to receive a better education. And this is, of course, a colonial legacy because the Chinese have been, basically prospering from their service to the colonial government by the Dutch, and also as an intermediary between the colonial authorities, the Western capital, and the indigenous and Chinese laborers. So, as the first ambassador to, China's first ambassador to Indonesia, Barnes says, in the eyes of some people with biases, maybe every Chinese has a shop, has a company, and they saw the big tree and they say, hey, the entire forest is made of gigantic trees. And in other words, the humble and modest background of the Chinese who involved in fishing, agriculture, who opened these papa and mama shops were obscured by the prominent wealth of small group of Chinese. In other words, like, it's true that there are Chinese elites who amassed a large amount of wealth under Suharto, but they were the ones who were able to flee from the violence in 1998. And those who suffered or those who are in a lower echelon of socioeconomic status. And they became the victim of this stereotype of the Chinese in Indonesia as rich and as exploitative. I think the important thing is to emphasize this is a structured and state-led stereotype of an ethnic minority. And Gemma Purdy, in her research, she commented on how the Chinese were kind of positioned in an institution in which they have no political voice and they have to purchase security. As a result, they were regarded as the source of corruption and economic inequality in Indonesia. So I'll stop here.
Great, thank you. I want to stay in the 60s for a minute, and then I think we've laid some of these layers to talk about how these themes are resounding in the present. John, there's quite a few questions about variance over the archipelago. For instance, what happened in Eastern Indonesia. And in fact, I could even throw in how much, for instance, the massacre of Chinese that came quite later in '67 in Kalimantan, and this is to you too, Taomo, did Chinese in China and repatriated or Indonesian Chinese who were in China, did they know about the killings and what was their attitude towards them? And for John, just what in Eastern Indonesia, it turns out, was so much later, the killings. Why was that? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about resistance in there too, if you want to, okay?
Well, I think that one part of the dynamic in Eastern Indonesia was mentioned in that question, which was that as we move into further into 1966, and it's clear that Sukarno is unable to stop Suharto's army from killing people, from moving from repression through mass arrests to repression through massacres. A lot of army officers realize that their future career is going to be through Suharto's group and not through Sukarno. And especially after March 1966, when it's absolutely clear that Sukarno has been, kicked out for, more or less, kept on as a figurehead. So at that point, there's a lot of army officers that realize a couple things. One is, they have a lot of prisoners, if they're still in an area where they have a lot of prisoners on their hands, they don't really want to spend the money to keep them up. And so I think one of the reasons why in certain areas of the country, and in the book I mentioned seems to be what's going on in South Sumatra, where the killing does begin later, around March, April 1966, is the decision by the army just not to spend any more money on keeping up the prisoners, keeping the prisoners alive, and not willing to release them either. So especially in those areas where there's lots of prisoners, and the army and the government and those who are involved in running the prisons just decide, we don't have the money for this. We don't want to get the money. They tell us, the higher ups say there's no money. We don't want to release them back into the society. So we'll kill them. And so that's one dynamic that comes from the killing of prisoners. It doesn't explain all of the, dynamics of the killing of prisoners in all areas. But I think that's certainly true in Palembang, in sort of South Sumatra area, and parts of Eastern Indonesia. And so the other dynamic there is that officers realize that if they are able to suppress a communist insurgency and say, look, I'm a hero because of my service here in suppressing the communist insurgency, then they will expect to get a promotion. And there's cases like that that go all the way up into the early 70s. And I spoke with a couple military officers too who were victims of that kind of thing, and that's how they understood it. that they were just made into a victim because some higher up in their service wanted to a storyline about how their service was infested with the PKI, and then this officer could position himself as a hero for having suppressed it. And it ties into the issue of torture, which I actually didn't answer before. Your question about torture was how, you know, by torturing the prisoners, they could make them say, yes, I was a PKI activist. I was a mole inside the army. I was doing all kinds of things. And then the officers in charge could then take that transcript and brandish it as proof to say, look, there was this insurgency. Torture has to be understood in a kind of bureaucratic sense. It's not just the individual act of it, but it's an institution that does it and that, you know, manages it. And in those kinds of institutional settings, it winds up completely messing up what, you know, any reference for truth. And so that's why in the chapter I have about torture, I describe it as the imposition of information, not the extraction. Forget about talking about it as extraction, at least in the Indonesian case, and I think many other cases as well. But here it's clearly, they're putting in a storyline, they're getting the prisoners to accept it, and then they go around and say, look, here's the proof that this is indeed the case. Yeah.
Yeah,
The
thank you.
question about Chinese knowledge and Indonesians in China, how much they knew, how much Chinese knew about the killings, and how did it influence views on Indonesia?
Right. So for the Chinese there are different batches of ethnic Chinese who migrated back to the People's, Chinese Indonesian who migrated back to the People's Republic China. There was a great number who left due to the Pepe Sepulu in 1959 to 1960. And there were also large groups who were expelled from Aceh in 1965 and 1966. So for the later group, they already experienced G30 and the mass violence in Indonesia itself. For those who arrived back in China earlier, so the PRC had a strategy of delaying the information for almost more than 20 days after the outbreak of the G30. And what I would like to emphasize here is that because for most of the Chinese Indonesians who went back, so-called went back to China, their communications with family or friends back in Indonesia basically were severe. This was largely because of the breach of the deterioration and later breach of diplomatic relations between Beijing and Jakarta. And most interestingly, this is why 1965 is important beyond Indonesia, is that it's synchronized with Mao's launch of the Cultural Revolution, right? So the rise of this excessive revolution regime in China and Suharto's authoritarian government are kind of two significant storming events in Cold War Asia, and they're mutually reinforcing, right? So Mao basically used September 30th movement and the ensuing violence, the political turmoil in Indonesia for domestic propaganda. So as I wrote in the last chapter of my book, basically the radio Peking started just cascading Suharto nonstop, accusing him of being a fascist. So this is the irony, right? So although China's role in this, the G30 was very limited, but this kind of propaganda ironically give the Suharto government, give the Indonesian military the pretext to say, hey, China was indeed the mastermind. And but what is interesting in that propaganda is that Beijing still focused solely on Suharto and the Indonesian military in its accusation. So it's still following this Marxist argument saying that, you know, there is class solidarity that will overcome racial division. The future of Indonesia is in the hands of the Pribumi proletariat. And Mao actually used what happened in Indonesia to say there is a vicious anti-China, anti-Chinese wing all over the world, right? So that he can mobilize the people to participate in Cultural Revolution, which sounds very similar, I think, to what is happening now in many parts of the world. I think there was another question about Kalimantan, right? The Chinese in Kalimantan.
That had an impact in China, the massacre of Chinese in Kalimantan.
Yes, so I'm glad you asked the question. I'm not an expert specialized in Kalimantan. I think Yufeng Hui has written a beautiful book about the Chinese in Kalimantan. So what happened in Kalimantan is quite unique for the Chinese community in the sense that first in the region there is a high concentration of ethnic Chinese, and they still maintain the use of Chinese dialects in their everyday life. And secondly, what is interesting is kind of the interlacing of domestic, regional, and international relations in the sense that that's where confrontasi took place, right? So during the confrontasi, there was kind of cross-border collaboration between the left-leaning ethnic Chinese in Kalimantan and the left-leaning Chinese in Sarawak, which is in Malaysia territory. However, with the rise of Suharto government, Indonesia pivoted toward the United States, de-escalating its confrontation with Malaysia. So as a result, the Kalimantan Chinese who participated in confrontation were basically left alone. And not only that, there were evidence to suggest that the Indonesian military tried to instigate ethnic antagonism between the Chinese and the local indigenous groups such as the Dayaks. So as a result, I think there was a larger number of ethnic Chinese being dislocated, being murdered, and also the violence took place much later than other parts of Indonesia. It basically took place in 1966 and 67.
What I absolutely feared has happened. We don't have enough time for everybody has had wonderful questions or comments. So here's what I'm going to do because we don't have much time left. I would like John. Taomo has talked about the effect in China. I just want you to, if you don't mind, talk a little about what the effect was in America and the paradox that they were quite quiet about it. The killings were going on and the United States didn't go around broadcasting it, or the journalists got the story that the army was telling them. But the ramifications of that was, what did Indonesia get out of it? But then I want to move to the present. For John, I would love for you to talk about after the fall of Suharto, there was a great deal of hope that there would be a reckoning with this past. Now it seems more elusive than ever. And in fact, the discourse of neo-PKI has come back and has currency. So I'd love for you to comment on that. And for you, Taomo, the complicated relationship of the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, we could talk about for days, but with the rise of China and with the perceived antipathy between Islam and Chinese, there has been a new wave of anti-Chinese sentiment. And I'd love for you to talk about how it resonates with the past and what it means for the present. Sorry, guys.
About how many minutes should I keep my comments to? Okay.
Sorry, we're going to run over, so you can talk as long as you want.
I won't talk that long. The one thing I haven't mentioned, which I guess is relevant here, is that I think one of the motivations for Suharto's group to push for killings of the prisoners in many parts of Indonesia was to demonstrate to the United States that it was very serious about suppressing the PKI, that it was a kind of demonstration to say to the United States, look, and actually there was a document from the US Embassy where a representative of Suharto's came and said, how much are these dead communists worth to you? And I think that says a lot. They're saying, we're doing this to show to you that we're very serious about this. And we expect some kind of something in return, investment, foreign aid, that. So, and it sort of worked out in their favor. But it did mean, though, large numbers of people were really unnecessarily killed. I mean, I can't stress this enough. This was a kind of violence that was completely unnecessary. That even if the kinds of tensions that existed within the society were such that they would lead to violence, it didn't have to be this kind of violence. It didn't have to be this extensive. It didn't have to lead to the killing of prisoners. It could have just been brawling, which was the kind of violence that had been going on before, and which would have involved far fewer casualties and would have involved more or other kinds of people, other groups stepping in to stop it. So this was a kind of contingent, and in the book I'm trying to lay out what are these contingent factors that led to the violence, because I'm even though I'm writing about violence, I'm trying to reinforce the stereotype that Westerners already have, that violence is somehow natural to Indonesia, and that if they read a report about some kind of massacre going on, they just treat it as naturals like palm trees or mangoes to Indonesia. That is completely, a complete misperception. That this kind of violence, and this is, I'm responding to some comments in the chat room here and the Q&A, that this is a kind of violence that can happen anywhere. That Indonesia is as modern a society as anywhere else, it always has been. And this perception that is somehow backward or that's really misleading. That and it is connected to a lot of other kinds of violence that's going on elsewhere in the world. I noticed that the Kenosha sheriff, right, the sheriff of Kenosha, what is it, county or city, before these events, talked about how there were 5 young men who had committed crimes in the county, and he said these people have to be disappeared. These people, he was talking about this as a kind of legitimate tactic of law enforcement. There's that kind of impulse to execution of people that you don't like, and then hiding the evidence and so forth. That is a tendency that's can be in any society, and I would point out here, again, to come back to your question, Margaret, about the effect in America. What America learned was that this is the way to do it, that this is the way to suppress communism, and that's what they hawked to the militaries in Latin America. And Vincent Bevan's new book is good on that point, to show how this traveled, that this kind of permanent solution to the presence of a communist party became a model to follow by other militaries. And it just didn't turn out as successful as it did in Indonesia, where this regime lasted for so long. So I think it's important to contextualize this violence in a world of violence, that this is not something really unique to Indonesia. It's not something, some kind of exotic violence. Particular to Indonesia, that there are, of course, particularities, but there are particularities in any part of the world. And anywhere you look in the world, there is this kind of violence, and especially during the Cold War, when the United States had this kind of power and was encouraging people to kill communists, to say, I mean, that's what it was doing throughout Latin America, and set up a school of the Americas, and it taught torture. And it taught dirty tricks, and it had, built up hundreds of bases around the world. So this whole story about, killing communists in Indonesia became, in the United States imagination of, U.S. government imagination, really a great success story, and it could help, became written about, like Kissinger did, everybody else did, and these officials, to say that, well, it actually helped out in this global war against communism, and fighting in Vietnam helped to make this possible too. And there's this length, really kind of specious length that gets set up there. But it became a kind of justification for this spread of a military empire around the world. And I think it's important to come back to some basic humanist principles that the killing of prisoners cannot be in any way justified. Torture cannot be in any way justified. We can't lose sight of those really simple principles.
You didn't get to the present, but we can't do everything. But
oh, sorry. Sorry.
To add on what John has said, I think the Jakarta method really show how the 65 had worldwide impacts in faraway countries such as Latin America. I want to give a shout out to a colleague in Singapore, Nguyen Ching's Arc of Containment, which he argues that basically the academics or the American general audience kind of preoccupation with the quagmire in Vietnam overshadowed American success in establishing allies all across all these anti-communist governments in Southeast Asia, in Malaya, in Singapore, and of course in Indonesia, right? Indonesia 65 was a big success, and I think Bevan's argued it's because it's so successful, that's why American public forgot about it, because it really embedded the entire Southeast Asia island chain into this arc of containment against communism. So I would like to talk a little bit about the present. So I think at least in the 20th century, we do see a pattern in which economic instability leads to the targeting of the ethnic Chinese. And it's not just in Indonesia, right? Worldwide, we see the escalation of ethnic tension in the age of pandemic and the economic havoc it caused, right? So in 1998, of course, the main rise was triggered by the Asia financial crisis. And in 1974, there was the malaria incident in which the visit by a Japanese prime minister, totally unrelated to the Indonesian Chinese community, triggered protests against corruption, and later the ethnic Chinese became affected because they were seen as contributing to the widening economic inequality. So now in Indonesia, we see large-scale protests against the omnibus law, and the law basically lowered the bar for labor protection and eased the way for the influx of foreign capital. So that we might see an influx of Chinese laborers and investment. And in fact, 5 years ago, Tempo magazine had run a very sensational and controversial issue about the so-called flooding of Chinese migrant workers. So how can we make of it? I think it's important to note that this is not like a conflict between China and Indonesia, right? Rising China trying to, we have a thunderstorm here. Rising China trying to not export communist revolution anymore, but to exploit Indonesian resources, labor, and occupy the market. But it's two countries facing a global crisis of neoliberalism. Because if we see the two countries together, after 1965, as John mentioned in his fabulous chapter on the rail and Sumatra, basically the organized labor were wiped out in a genocidal fashion, right? And this paved the way for Indonesia's integration to the American-led neoliberal economy. And so basically the state invests less in social welfare, the kind of industrial citizenship that rose in both the West and East Camp during Cold War went into decline. So in both China and Indonesia, we see workers losing their social status and political voice and became merely hired hands with little protection in social safety net. So I think it's fundamentally a structural problem of global economy. And and unfortunately, I think around the world, not only in Indonesia, which now is contentious, but in the United States, in Europe, in the Philippines, in Brazil, we see populist politicians who could not solve this structural economic problem, but frame this issue in terms of identity politics for their own benefits.
Yeah. Thank you. So I'm going to say thank you to everyone. I feel a bit horrible because we didn't get to all the questions, and there's so many of the comments are so fascinating. So John has looked over some of them, so I'm giving you the last word, John. If you can bring us up a little bit to what you think about where we go from here and the present in Indonesia, or I don't know how you want to frame it, because you're the labor part. Taomo just did pretty well, but so however you want to do it. And thank you, everyone. And we're going to cut it off right after John talks.
I guess one thing is, I can say a little bit about your question before about bringing it up to the present, because there was a comment to say that the Indonesian government has been doing some things about this, but the fact is that whatever it's been doing has been completely ineffectual when it comes to documenting what happened, releasing any documentation about the massacres, digging up mass graves. That could really help in even just locating mass graves. Instead, the territorial command of the army is designed precisely to prevent any kind of investigation like that. So it's, anything else is just window dressing, and even there hasn't even been a lot of window dressing either when it comes to sort of uncovering this. The 2016 Symposium National, which was meant to just begin a discussion about the events, was shut down, and with the sort of hysterical reaction by the right-wing groups, and since then there really hasn't been any follow-up. So, but that said, reading through some of these comments is actually quite depressing to see just how persistent this idea is that, oh, the PKI wasn't innocent. It was a political party. It wanted political power. It was organizing for political power, just like any other political party. It doesn't mean it has to be completely innocent. It just means that they were human and they shouldn't have been massacred. I mean, something like, okay, massacre is wrong. Can I say that? Okay, you don't massacre people. This is what I'm trying to get. There's no justification for this whole scale of these massacres that went from one end of the country to another. There were questions about how this was organized. And in my book, I'm trying to show how it was very sort of loosely organized, and what are the ways in which there was this sort of central direction and central pressure, but at the same time, pushback from different areas, and in some cases, direct intervention from the center to get killings moving. But even then, it was tied in with local dynamics. Indonesia is a big country, it's very complicated. These kinds of stories really need to be dealt with in more detail. For every, if you think about other genocides in the world, even ones that occurred long ago, like the Armenian genocide, over 100 years ago, there's more detailed studies, local studies and studies of particular institutions, and than there is on Indonesia in 1965. This book was really difficult to write because I was trying to, write about the whole country when in fact, the experiences are so different in different areas. And yet there are these connections at the same time. It really needs a lot more people working on this and digging up more things literally about specific massacres, being able to say more precisely as to who was responsible when these events occurred. People were asking about the number of victims, and there's no way of knowing precisely because of the way this whole history was erased. And so we just have these very rough estimates. But there needs to be, Jess Melvin has written a book about Aceh. There needs to be a lot more books about North Sumatra, where workers, plantation workers, unionized workers were rounded up and massacred. Again, there's no justification for that, even if you don't like organized workers. You know, you don't, you don't round them up, imprison them, and then take them out at night and massacre them, as was shown in Joshua Oppenheimer's films. South Sumatra as well. There needs to be a lot more work on that, on Riau, on Jambi, and so forth. You go through every region of the country. There needs to be a lot more work if we're ever going to be able to answer these questions with more precision. But I hope that buried history, sort of helps with a kind of methodology for moving us forward there.
I saw a comment about what can millennials do. Well, get to work, millennials.
But I should say a lot of millennials have been involved. Ingat 65 and
there's been a lot. Yeah. Thank you. We've gone way over. Buy these books and read them. And it's sure we should do this again. Thank you.